the cloud. Yeah, so I guess I wanted to know what your perspective is like on concussion recovery in general, and in particular, what you recommend for people when they get a concussion. Like, because there seems to be so many different approaches now.
Yep. Well, I mean, it's very individualized, right?
Yeah.
So everybody's concussion is going to be different. How you respond to the concussion symptoms, your progress back to normal is all going to be different. Um, and a lot of times that's because, there's a lot of different parts to the brain, and depending on which one gets hit, you get different responses. It's not just, oh, I hurt this one organ, so it's the same every single time. It's based on the area of the brain that was affected by the impact. You get different responses, and you have to treat those in different ways. So,
Yeah, so when people come to you, like when I came to you, you were able to determine, certain things that were going on with me that, you know, I had no idea. Like, I mean, I didn't know that I wasn't smelling very well,
right. Yep. Yep.
or tasting. And,
Hmm.
so are you seeing a lot of people with concussions, head injuries, and do you help people find out what part of their brain it is that needs help?
So that's what I'm there for. I'm not going to tell you that I'm working with a ton of people for that because people aren't necessarily coming and looking for that specifically unless they're having really serious concussion problems and they feel like they're at a loss and they're not improving. Um, so generally, people that I end up working with are if something happens to one of my current clients or somebody who's a current client meets somebody or knows somebody who's had a concussion, like, oh, you should go check out Shane and help with that. So there's still this people realize that concussions are more serious now than they used to. They're it's important to do things for them, but not a lot of people know what to do or who to go to yet. So there's still that growing piece of things. Unfortunately, doctors are taking them more seriously now. So, but you get some more of that referral going on. It's definitely a growing field that way. Um, but personally, what I do is with the background that I have in neuroanatomy and having learned how to do a wide range of neurological tests. And when I say that, it's not that I'm a neurologist who is looking for clinically relevant information from these things to diagnose a specific issue. It's more about noticing side to side differences within these different tests. Like you mentioned, smelling, vision, taste, hearing, coordination, all those types of things. When you start to notice these individual side to side differences, now you're finding a pathway where you can give stimulus to those places that have differences to bring them back up to a balanced level.
Yeah, that's
So,
so cool how you can do that. That's really, really so interesting to me, and so wonderful all in one thing. You know, why do you think it is that we're just coming around to this now? What you've been involved in this for a long time. I mean, what's
well, one of the biggest things is the scientific advancements that have come along, like the fMRI and all those types of things, so that we're actually able to do the research on the brain at a much more detailed level than we ever could before. Um, so because the science has come so far, we have the ability to tailor and understand what's happened and give the correct therapies for that. So, previously, just even 10 years ago, okay, you have a concussion, you have a headache. It wasn't much more than that. Now that the research has been able to be like, okay, if you hurt this part of the brain, you get these responses, this part of the brain, those responses. How do we test for those? Now that that has advanced, now the hands-on therapy side is trailing behind that, right? So as that knowledge accumulates, it gets passed down to the people who are actually working with the clients, and they can now be more specific in their treatments and their guidance and their therapies.
What's the most exciting advancement or some of the most exciting advancements that you've learned of lately?
Um, that is a good question. I guess some of the, I wouldn't say it lately, but some of the most exciting stuff is just that now that it's becoming more mainstream, um, people are paying attention, and the anything's just like sports leagues getting that much more involved in it. You see it with the NFL, and they have their injury tent that they go to, even when they possibly suspect that somebody might have a concussion, and they're taking those people off the field before it becomes a bigger deal. So things like that is really exciting, like just the seriousness that's been taken. And then because the word is getting out, um, what's most beneficial for concussion management is having a baseline. So the tests and that I run with people, if I can do that before they have a concussion, when they come back in, now I can actually see what has changed versus just guessing at, okay, maybe the concussion changed the side to side differences that we're seeing. So just that knowledge and awareness for people to be like, oh, there's value in a pre-screening. Let's get that done. So when something comes along, I'm more prepared to deal with it and can manage it more quickly. It's pretty much the most exciting point from my point of view.
Yeah, there's just so much that's happened since my injury, and I've become really aware of how complex. I mean, not that I thought our brain was so simple before, but it's really, I mean, to say it's like an onion isn't really exact either because it doesn't peel open, as far as the injury goes, like evenly, depending on, like you say, where it is and all of that.
Mhm, mhm,
So
mhm,
I've um I've been trying to figure out, what would be the best course of action for determining exactly what needs to be done and what's wrong with someone who's had a head injury, because as you say, it can happen in different parts. And I know that the functional MRI will show some things, but it also misses other things, such as you
mhm,
can then see in a neurofeedback.
mhm,
And
mhm,
the Loretta, the Z scan of a Loretta. And so there's a lot of different things that have to be done. And then on top of that, I went for 5 years not having the sutures in my cranium addressed. So
mhm, mhm,
I went to a doctor of osteopathy, and he's trained in a particular method of cranial sacral, which he says is fading out, unfortunately. And because a lot of doctors, he said, think that it's like the voodoo, falls into the voodoo thing,
yep, yep.
But he said, honestly, we had this conversation several sessions later, but he put his hands on me the first time, and my brain fog went away after five
Wow,
years. And
wow.
then he explained to me why that works. And I thought, wow, so when someone gets a head injury, we have all these different things that are going on, but the structural integrity, if someone
Mhm,
gets in a car accident or gets their head impaled in a visible fashion so that we're able to see the injury, then we all know it's there. But if we can't see that, if we can't see that the sutures are been misaligned and it's creating a misflow of your cerebral brain fluid, like which is
mhm.
impacting you. Did you learn about that? I mean, do you know about that? What do you know about that? Or
So, um, not that specifically. I don't have any craniosacral training. Um, but so things are multifactorial, right? You have a brain injury, and so that can cause an impact to a different part of the brain. And a lot of times, even if, say, we got hit on the right side of the head, the part of the brain that might have been affected is the left because the brain bounces around inside the skull. That's the real concussion. So you do always have to be aware that because it's that ricochet action, the spot of the impact doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what will have been impacted in the brain itself. And then things that I have also learned about is coupled with that, you also have the the blood flow trauma, right? So with an injury, there's going to be swelling. Hopefully it's not so much where you have to have a surgery to reduce the swelling on the brain and all that kind of stuff. But even still, the way the blood flows within the brain can be affected from the injury. And that's why personalizing the response for the person matters so much. Do they need increased blood flow? Or do you actually need to be wary of how much you increase the blood flow because that turns symptoms up, right? And that's why it's so individualized with the person that way. And then to your point of, just putting the hands on you, brain fog going away, the sutures. Remember, your brain is always taking in like tons of sensory information, right? So if you have sutures going through one part of your head that's causing tension on one side versus the other side, your brain knows all that's going on. And it's accommodating the way that you move and the way that you function for its new state. And then if those compensations are mild, it may not present itself in symptoms. If you're unable to compensate for the new things that have happened, that's when you develop symptoms. Now you have to go back and unwind, okay, what's actually causing the symptoms? And it could be from something as simple as just having the skin being pulled weird, affects the blood flow, affects the sensation to the brain responds, and you have to adjust those things. So the reason I understand why they call those things like pseudosciences or whatever, it's because it's hard to, because every situation is so individualized, it's hard to create a clinical study to be like, okay, if we do this craniosacral work, we know we get this response out of it. It just doesn't work that way. It's an anecdotal, one person at a time therapy. And what you're doing is you're changing the stimulus of the person. And that is either increasing or alleviating symptoms because of the stimulus that you've changed. So all these different modalities have their ability. It's tough to create a protocol around them.
Yeah, it's just it's like peeling back the layers of
Yep.
everything, isn't it? To figure out when you come down to feeling well again. Um, I've had the opportunity to work with some people who have had injuries that have impacted their ability to move their arm, let's say. And
Mhm.
they are working, of course, with other people for that. But I must say that it seems to be something that no one really has a great answer for so far. And I was thinking about you and like, what do you know about that? Or what do you work with people like that?
I mean, sure, people who are having, I mean, you weren't super specific in exactly what the movement issue is, but you can put those things on a continuum, right?
Hmm.
So even just having a little bit of pain in your shoulder is a starting point for not being able to move the arm at all, right? So if you're on that continuum, what's cool about the way that I work with things is um, there's the feedback goes both out of the brain and back to the brain, right? So the brain works on that looped cycle. You have sensory inputs coming in, the brain has to make a decision about that, then it has to create outputs. Okay. So if you understand that, and that every single output creates new inputs, you can start to interject on different parts of that cycle. And what that means is if somebody is having trouble moving the arm, previous therapeutic things were let's try to move the arm. So that's basically an output, right? But we can also go the other direction now, and we can start treating the arm's sensation, making sure everything is being felt right through the arm. Okay. So that's one way to provide stimulus. You can then work further up the chain. So we have sensory receptors in the skin of the arm. There are peripheral nerves that take that information up to the brain. As it goes up to the brain, it has to travel through part of the brain, the cerebellum. Some of that information goes into the brainstem. All of that information then crosses over and goes to the cortex. along that journey, it has to go through the decision-making places like the thalamus, stuff like that. So if you understand this pathway, and then if the information goes back down that pathway, you can start to interject more input stimulus along that pathway to find what added stimulus creates the neurological response to allow you to do a little bit more. So an example of that might be, we have an arm that's having trouble being moved, okay? Let's say that there was a whiplash head injury. So there's a chance that from the whiplash, there's an effect in the brainstem, okay? Well, the brainstem is very important for midline stability. And if you're unstable on one side of the body, it's challenging to move the opposing side, okay? So if we provide stimulus to the brainstem, maybe it's through something as simple as swallowing, humming, listening to audio tones that go into the different cranial nerves of the brainstem, you can create stimulus, which gets neurons firing, it gets blood flow to the area. That might provide added stability on the opposite side of the body that allows this arm to move better. And once you have that, you can layer it with more traditional therapies to now work on that output side. Okay, let's learn, now that the arm's moving a little further, let's learn how to move it better. And that becomes a loop where now you're training the ability to be like, oh, it's safe for me to move this arm higher and higher and higher. That's how you begin to restore movement. But the starting point was being able to create the stability so the arm could move higher. And so the beauty of it is it just gives you, if traditional stuff is not doing enough, it gives you just more things that you can layer in until you find the right combination.
Wow, that is so cool. Have you ever worked with someone with that particular issue or an issue similar to that?
I mean, common of people having pain or discomfort moving their arm is super, super common. Um, and the cool part is, sometimes you can create and elicit immediate change, and other times it takes time for that change to happen. So there's been once, it was a while ago, I had a woman come in who was coming in for just basic training, but she had a shoulder injury where when she did certain things, it always hurt. And it literally took one drill of just working on an eye position, and she was able to move her arm and didn't have any issues again. So that was one of those lucky circumstances where that one stimulus and being able to do that was needed, and you give it, and all of a sudden the pain goes away because the brain no longer feels like it's under threat. So it frees up the body to do what should happen. More commonly, it's about that slow progression of, okay, we can only get the arm to a certain height. Let's check and make sure that sensation is appropriate through there. Because if we can't move, if we can't feel well, we can't move well. That's an anatomical setup in the brain where sensory comes before motor. And to take a little detour and give you some info on that, if people have strokes to the part of the brain that is dealing with that sensory information, they'll lose the ability to move. So as you restore, movement function comes back. So as you begin to restore that, they get a little bit more movement. Now, depending on how long it's been an issue, they might have forgotten how to move well there. So you start to retrain good movement, pain-free movement. And you can start to expand that circle of what's pain-free with practice, time, and training. And that's how you can slowly begin to restore function when you don't get that immediate, like, lucky guess as to it was just looking up in this corner that they needed.
How about people who have trouble talking again? Have you had any
That
experience with that or?
that's not something I've specifically dealt with.
Mhm.
But it's so thing I'd have to go back and actually like look at the anatomy of different things, but there's specific areas of the brain that deal with speech. So if it's an ability to recall words versus create words, those are different areas of the brain. And
Mhm.
you'd want to know where that lives within the brain, stimulate other structures through other tools that live near there. So generally speaking, language areas, lives in and around the temporal lobe, things that affect the temporal lobe, memories, sound, scent. So you could play with those things to create more stimulus to those areas. Okay. If it has something to do with physically creating the speech, now you're talking about throat and tongue, right? So you can do exercises that stimulate the cranial nerves that drive those things. You can also do exercises, maybe it's through vision, where you're stimulating the cortex part of the brain that feeds the voluntary movement down into the throat to move the tongue to adjust the vocal cords. So again, there's lots of different pathways that you could possibly approach to create the added stimulus need to get things moving again. And the way that happens is through, that good history up front, like I talked about, the screening that we did the first time we met, where we went through everything and found out what was a little different from side to side. And then you test it. So you provide the stimulus and see if it creates even a small amount of change. If it does, then that's a pathway you can dig deeper into to help the results come.
That's really great information. And, I'm going to keep this to the half an hour point, because I'm imagining that people who are going to be watching this are going to be pretty much done at that point. So that wasn't a good plan right there.
Let me give you a quick summary on this that makes it really simple. Because the brain is so multifactorial, there's always hope. If you do the data collection to find out where there are weaknesses, you can then provide the stimulus for those weaknesses. If you assess and reassess the different stimulus, just meaning, is it producing a change or not? You can narrow down exactly what stimuli you need. And then you just use more of it and more of it and more of it to finally get yourself where you need to be. It's, in a nutshell, that simple. It's just knowing the background points to be able to do each one of those pieces, where if you're not into this all the time, where you typically want to reach out for help.
So the data collection you're speaking of is what you do and what you did with me, right? And
Correct. So it's taking a history, because what happened before what happened matters. And then it's collecting, it's a basic neurological exam, cranial nerve tests, movement tests, sensory tests, vision tests. So that's the data collection. Okay, what's going on here? What patterns are emerging? And then once you have an idea of that, now it's like, okay, I understand the anatomy well enough where I can start to give targeted drills that stimulate these areas. Some of them are going to work, some of them aren't. Finding the ones that work then allow you to really tailor in for that one person, because everybody's needs are going to be different. And that's why protocols will often work for some people, but some people it doesn't work. You need that more detailed, specific, collect the data, assess and reassess what works, and then do more of what works.
Wow, that's so great. Thanks, Shane. I
Absolutely.
really appreciate your being here.
My
If
pleasure. Thank
someone
you for
wants
inviting
to
me.
find you and wants to communicate with you, how would they do that?
So my studio is Matrix Personalized Fitness. The website is matrix-pf.com. And there's an easy way to just connect through there. There's, contact us sheet. You can write down your information and we get the email that sends it. If anybody needed to reach out to me directly, it's shane@matrix-pf.com. And we do have a social media presence on Facebook and Instagram. So you could always message through that if that's your preference. We check it daily. So we receive them that way too.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Well, thank you.